Cte Pro 1 Truth Series, video number 5, the building blocks of Cte Pro 1. I've spent the last 15 or 16 years totally immersed into a study of center to edge aiming. One thing that I can say with 100% certainty is that I have encountered a multitude of building blocks, Cte Pro 1 building blocks, that must be in place for one to totally understand CTE and for one to apply CTE at its highest level. Yes, there's lots of levels for using center to edge aiming. The one thing that really drew me in to CTE was the idea that a center cue ball and an outer cutting edge of an object ball could be used for handling nearly all shots. If that were true, then I certainly wanted to know about it, because I wanted my son Landon to have that aiming system. Hal Houle assured me that it was the ultimate professional aiming system. Never once did I doubt him. Never once. I was so intrigued with the idea that I decided to go forward with trying to learn as much about it as I could. Hal told me on the phone in this very room, probably in around 2005, he said, "You'll never figure it out by yourself. It's too odd. It's too different. You'll never get it." So he was actually planning on stopping by my home on a trip from the West Coast eastward. But that didn't materialize. But that didn't stop me from studying center to edge aiming with all of my might. I wanted to know if this were so. I wanted my son to have it. So I started putting the building blocks together. There's quite a few of them. Let's take a look at the building blocks for Cte Pro 1. My body of work can be described as Cte Pro 1. So there's lots of building blocks that we're going to put in place. A very important first principle for center to edge aiming is the idea that the system is applied on a 2x1 table. Hal Houle identified 3 critical angles on 2x1 tables that are necessary for CTE to work: the 15, the 30, and the 45. Another very important building block that you must understand is that aiming occurs from the edge of the cue ball. You aim with the cue ball edge. You have 2 edges on the cue ball, a left edge and a right edge. You aim at 3 targets on the object ball. We call them A, B, C. Essentially, they're associated with the angles of a regulation table. So you have the angles on the table, 15, 30, and 45. There's 4 sets of these angles on a regulation table. And then Hal Houle discovered the perceptions and how to see the perceptions that are commensurate with the angles of 15, 30, and 45. So it's very important to school yourself on how to really aim. You aim with the edge of the cue ball, not the center. Amateurs aim with the center of the cue ball. Hal Houle once told me, I think I've shared this story before, but it's always stuck in my mind, that he said all the instructors that he had ever interviewed were doing it the wrong way. And cue ball edge aiming was one of them. How do our instructors primarily teach today? With center cue ball. Aim with center cue ball. That's not how to really aim. That puts you into the guesswork, feel domain. Another very important building block is sighting. You aim with the edge of the cue ball. You sight with the center of the cue ball. I was the very first person to put the Houle's aiming domain and his sighting domain together. And when I put these two together, that was the most important move that I ever made. The most important single move that I ever made. And that was back in 2010. Of course, I cover all these in tremendous detail in my book, and I will do so to a great degree in this Truth series. Now, when I worked with DVD 1 and DVD 2, these building blocks were in place, but not totally developed. They were in place, but not totally developed. But I was moving forward. I would not be here were it not for the work with, my early work with Pro 1, DVD 1, and DVD 2. You see, when you swing the bat, you don't always hit the ball. But you can hit the ball unless you swing the bat. My work with DVD 1 and DVD 2 offered and provided very, very important building blocks. And many people use those building blocks and were able to use CTE. Perhaps they didn't understand everything about it. And that's normal. I used Pro 1 in the 2011 US Open. I used it successfully, but I couldn't explain everything at the time about what was going on. But now I can. This building block was not developed hardly at all in DVD 1 and DVD 2, and that is the building block for parallax vision. You see, one thing that Hal Houle knew 70 years ago, he understood that professional players were not putting their nose behind center cue ball. He knew that they were offsetting at ball address while they were standing. None of this can happen. This can't happen. CTE is totally wiped away without parallax vision. CTE, by way of parallax vision, widens your visual scope. It widens what you're able to do with your vision. Whereas putting your nose behind center absolutely limits what you're capable of seeing and knowing about cue ball, object ball relationships. If there's a golden egg within this wall of building blocks, it might be gearing. Hal Houle, he used to love to put a cue ball and an object ball together and just twist them. Twist one way and one the other. And he would say, this is how you really do it. Gearing. You know what Hal Houle knew? He knew what the professional players were doing back in his day. They're still doing it today. They're gearing the balls. When you put your vision at parallax, you're working with the inside of the cue ball and virtual and essentially the outside of the object ball, creating a gearing effect. Hal knew they weren't using ghost ball and contact points and fractions. He knew that they were gearing the balls. So you can know right now, this is what professionals are doing. They're gearing the balls. The cue ball and the object ball. You have to put all these blocks in place to do it. But do you want to do what the pros are doing? Do you want to understand what they're seeing? That's been a thirst that many of us have had for decades. What does the professional see? What are they looking at? They're gearing the balls. I do want to back up and say one thing about parallax vision. You can use parallax vision while you're standing, but Hal Houle paved the way for us to also be able to use parallax vision when we're in full stance. So it takes a lot of work to learn how to use your vision in a parallax manner. While standing, it's easy, it's natural, and you may not even know you're doing it. Most of you, if you're good players, you're already doing it. Richard Bach said something similar to this. He said, you don't need faith to fly, you need to understand flying. You don't need faith to understand CTE. You don't need faith to apply CTE. You need to understand CTE. That's why these building blocks have been put in place, so that you can understand center to edge aiming thoroughly. You don't need faith anymore for it to work. I was flying on faith at the US Open. I had enough building blocks in place to be able to win some matches. But there was some more important information that I still needed so that I could reach my full potential with center to edge aiming. This is a concept that you must understand thick and thin. When you look at a cue ball object ball relationship, you have to know if it's thick or thin in relation to the pocket. All of this is covered. By looking at thick and thin, you'll understand whether you need an inside or an outside pivot. You know, pivoting has gotten a real bad rap over the years. It's like, I'm not going to do some kind of mechanical pivot. I don't see the pros do it. I'm not going to do it. Pivoting is a very subtle thing that occurs. I could shoot 1,000 shots right now and you would never see me pivot. There's a lot to it. I explain it all. I'll go over in the Truth series. It'll be in my book. You have to understand arm alignment. You see, in conventional aiming, you just put your nose behind center or your strongest vision center, and you sort of line up in a target shooting position with your arm, let's just call it centered, so that it's something that you can repeat. Hal Houle knew that was wrong. He knew that instructors that were teaching that were teaching it incorrectly. As far as in contrast to how it's really done. If you want to aim objectively, you're going to have to learn that your arm has an out position and it has an inward position of no relation to inside pivot or outside pivot. Because I can have an outward arm position for an inside pivot. But it's a building block. It's a building block for getting to here. Now, I want to emphasize, you don't have to get to here. I'm going to give you the entire body of work for CTE, and then you can do what you want with it. So, arm position. Then there's bridge V placement. Bridge V placement. Can I explain to you where to put your bridge V on the table so that when you pivot, your key will go to center? I absolutely can. And if I couldn't, I'd be up the creek. It wouldn't matter if I used a 9mm very thin shaft or a 15mm fat shaft. I can tell you where to put your bridge V so that both will work. In DVD 1 and DVD 2, I was refined, but not refined enough. The bridge V placement was basically described as being a half-tip pivot. Well, I can make all shots with a half-tip pivot, I assure you. But there's more to it than just meets the eye. It's how the eyes work. It's how the eyes work that determine where the bridge V is placed, so that the ensuing pivot will take you to the center cue ball, the target. So bridge V placement. Bridge V placement is critical. It's critical. Bridge V placement is not a feel aspect of center to edge aiming. Now, when I say center to edge aiming, center to edge, we have the 15, the 30, and the 45. Now, there are aim lines for the 15, 30, and 45, and there are sight lines for the 15, 30, and 45. I want to highlight at this time that the center to edge sight line for the 30 is not what I'm talking about. It's not what I'm referring to. When I say you can use one center and one edge for handling nearly all shots. There is no one single sight line that can handle all shots. The 30 is a huge workhorse. It can handle a lot of shots. But you cannot use one sight line and then pivot to center for all shots. It's an impossibility. Unless you just feel your way into that. I mean, I could look at a doorknob and make all shots. Right before I shoot, I just look at the doorknob and then shoot to make the ball. You can't just look at center to edge and make all shots. It's like, that'd be like looking at the doorknob for making all shots. Now, I used to do that early on. My early work with Pro 1 was centering the outer edge for every shot. But after, I don't know if it was a year or two of that, I knew that the SP30, the centered edge sight line, could not make all shots. The next building block, and boy was this a tough one. I did not get this one put together until I was a year or more into my book. I was at a point to where if I couldn't describe center cue ball and describe the bridge V placement, the book project would close, because I was not about to produce a writing project that I couldn't objectively describe every aspect of it. That I was not about putting forth a field system. That was not my goal. So I spent untold hours trying to understand how that 9mm shaft and 15mm shaft could get me to center cue ball. How can I get my bridge V in the right place? Well, you know the story about stepping the cue ball. You know, in my opinion, something like this concerning our game of pool is discovered every few hundred years. We would not be here had I not taken my trip to the round structure. Stepping is huge. You can't get to center and edge without understanding stepping and all of these other building blocks. So you must, and it is a must, you must put these building blocks in place if you want to use and understand CTE in the right manner. I'm going to be sharing with you how to use Pro 1. Pro 1 is your path of least resistance for using CTE. It's it's strong as a racehorse. Landon uses Pro 1 to this day. I've had some great successes with Pro 1. Hal Houle understood that professional players were standing at an offset and sweeping into the shots. That's essentially what Pro 1 is. You can be going through the motions of Pro 1, but yet not understand the underpinnings that are occurring under the hood. But I can assure you it's important to understand all of this. Basic CTE. I would say basic CTE is at the foundation of it all. When you use Pro 1, when I use Pro 1, I'm not using a center and an edge. Oh, down the road, 6 months or a year, I may do a video showing how you can use Pro 1 with just a center and an edge. But it's not necessary at all. But I want to explain it to you. I'm going to take you to the nth degree of everything that I understand about CTE. With basic CTE, you're not going to use center and edge. You're going to use your 15, your 30, and your 45, and your aim lines, and your sight line, and pivoting, and all of these building blocks. This is your major teacher. You have to decide how many of these blocks you want to put in place. When you get to disguised pivoting, which is what I use, disguised pivoting represents an evolution for me to where gearing and, well, gearing is the major impetus. It's the force that puts my application of CTE into motion. Gearing. Hal Houle used to show this. Hal Houle wants us to learn to be aware of gearing. Even when you're doing Pro 1, be aware of the gearing that occurs when you're establishing your visual. When you're doing basic CTE, be aware of the gearing that's occurring for basic CTE. You see, He was laying the foundation. He was laying the foundation for us to be able to use pure gearing. I have something written into my book. It's a little section in the disguised pivoting section where it says, I get into full gear when I'm doing disguised pivoting. I just gear the balls using a center, not the sightline center. I'm using the step center. I'll go to the step center immediately, and I gear the inside of the cue ball with the outside of the object ball, looking at the outer edge, and when the gearing is correct, I stop. So I've used the center and I've used the edge, but when the gearing stops, guess what? From my parallax viewing position, the aim line is intact, the sight line is intact. So the gearing stops because the aim line has been aimed up. The sight line, the center to edge sight line, which one it might be, whether for the 15, 30, 45, or 60. So I have evolved over the years into being able to just purely gear the balls. But I can't do it unless I have these building blocks in place, because when I'm gearing, guess what? I'm in a parallax viewing position. My arm is either in an out position or an in position. I've stepped the cue ball in an instant, almost to the point of just total subconsciousness. I'm using the outer edge of the object ball in a gearing relationship to the inside of the cue ball. But yet at the same time, all of my building blocks allow me to know when the gearing stops just by using a center and an edge. So I'm letting you know what's possible. I'm letting you know where you can go if you can study, if you want to study that much. And then there's half-ball pivoting. Half-ball pivoting is really nothing more than Pro 1 that's being used during full stance. So I'm going to show you. We'll be coming up on some videos where I'll be doing several shots using Pro 1, basic CTE, disguised pivoting, and half-ball pivoting. I'm going to show you all of the intricacies of how these are used. If you like what you see, you'll love what's in the book. But can you use one tick, one center cue ball tick, and one object ball edge for handling nearly all shots? My answer to that is yes. But there's a distinction. It is not center to edge as in the sight line of center to edge like SP30. That won't work. The center that you're using, is the stepped center. The outer edge on the object ball that you're using is an edge or a tick that has been rotated. So when your gearing stops, essentially you're aligned at the step center. When the gearing stops, everything's in place. Your parallax vision, your arm is in or out, the sight line is in place, the aim line is in place. So you see, it's an impossibility to get here without putting these other building blocks in place, and my book does that beautifully. My book gives you the building blocks. So yes, it is possible to use one center cube optic, the step center, in conjunction with one object ball outer edge. In other words, a tick that has been rotated to a specific position. Well, this is a pretty good look at the major building blocks of my body of work, Cte Pro 1. If you're interested in learning about Cte Pro 1, you're going to find the information here. You won't find the building blocks put together anywhere else. I would like to say this. The clues, the pieces of the puzzle that were necessary to get all this put together were just about lost. If I were starting my journey now and studying center to edge, I don't think I could pull all this together. It would be several times harder. So it had just about gotten away from us. So I'm proud. I'm thrilled to present to you, by way of this CTE Truth Series and my book, the entire body of work that you need for understanding and applying CTE in whatever method that you choose, whether it's Pro 1, Basic CTE, disguise pivoting, or half ball pivoting. Before we start with shots for these 4 methods, or Cte Pro 1 approaches, I'm going to do a couple of videos. I want to add a little bit of information to gearing. So I'm going to do one video on gearing, and then I'm going to do one video on stepping. I want to give you just a little bit more of a refined look at gearing and stepping before we start with shots for the 4 CTE approaches. Thank you, and see you in Truth Series Video 6.